Hey, it's Chris. What are we doing? Yonder, take 2. What do you need to know from this upcoming worker placement game from SInister Fish with a lighter style of fantasy? I don't mean lighter in terms of weight necessarily, but it's not the kill, death that we often see with ogres, dwarves, skeletons, and goblins. What do you need to know? Because it's got a little bit of a twist. It's got a little something to set it apart, and helping you figure out whether or not it's right for you, as always. Because this is take 2 because I ran out of memory on my computer and the whole thing errored. 30 minutes down the drain. Let's go again, though, because second time will be better. Set up in front of you, mid-game sort of scenario to illustrate some points that we're going to be talking about here. In general, you are playing worker placement over 5 rounds in order to end up with the most gold as your victory points. We'll talk about why that's important in a second and why you're also going to have to be careful with that. Now, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be gradually acquiring workers on a round-by-round basis, as well as utilizing them on your action tableau system of buildings, which you are going to have in front of you as you slowly gather the resources in order to play them out to utilize them going forward. This has a few twists from the worker placement side of things in order to actually give it a spot in your collection, but again, they may not be for you, and that's why we're going to talk about this. I'm going to give you an overview of the main 2 phases of this game so that you can figure out whether or not this is right for you. So the main part of this game is, like I said, worker placement. You have your various types of workers. You've got your green little goblins here, you've got the yellow elves, you've got the red ogres, the brown dwarves, and if I can find the misplaced one over here, the white skeletons. And so the main twist of this is going to be giving you the slight asymmetry between said workers in the first place, which we'll talk about in a minute. The other aspect is, as you can see, even just like a Lords of Waterdeep, we have a city set up in front of us that are having various worker placement spots of the various actions that you're going to be regularly utilizing to convert one resource to another, but as well, the other twist, to feed your workers a la other things like Agricola or those other ilk. So it's got a little bit of a twist there, and we'll talk about why that may be one of the bigger make it break it's for you as a whole. Now, then on the rest of the board, you've got ships up here that are incoming. You've got your envoys, which allow for resource mitigation and use of ships in a different way. And then you have buildings down here in the lower left-hand corner, which are going to be your main action tableau system as a whole. You also have a favor track, which you'll slowly be maneuvering your way up. Yes, I did that on purpose. And then you have a lower right-hand track here, which is the upper city, which is going to be just places where you can place special, utilized one-time only Arcanum resource to cover them up to get special bonuses that are going to be gathered along the way. So now that you have a gist of what's going on the board, let's talk about this. It's going to be a 5-round system where essentially all you're doing on your turn-by-turn basis is you're placing your worker. That's it, to one of the various spots on the board or one of the various spots in your tableau in front of you. Afterwards, or even before, you can take the 2 other optional actions, one of them being the said Arcanum that I just talked about, placing it over here as this is done and used, never comes off the board, sits there and can't be duplicated by anyone else later, or you take one of your boats, which we'll segue into right now. Boats are the main way in which you're gathering workers on a round-by-round basis. This is the other big divisive element we need to talk about. You will be utilizing them as an optional action, though, because they don't just give you fancy whatever they're showing you. They also become important because you're going to be choosing one of these envoys over here as your optional action to then place on the card itself and utilize the actions that are present at the bottom of the card. Again, various resource management ways, if you will. So for example, here, this is the Skeleton Apprentices. I place my boat there. I get my 2 gold if I would prefer to get that, as opposed to whatever bonus down here I can get for the first time use. But then I can trade in these 3 resources 1 or 2 times to get resources gold victory point wise, based on the round number, plus a skeleton worker for each time I do it. So if I traded in 4 wood and 2 ore, because I can do it 2 times this, I would get, if this is round 3, which is the marker I have over here on the board, I get 3 gold at this round, and then I would get 6 gold total, and I would get 2 skeleton workers. The tricky part about this is, we'll talk about why you need to be very careful on choosing these envoys in a minute. Because the other aspect of things is you go and you place all your workers on the worker placement spots. That is what you do until you can't do it. Then at the end, when you can no longer do that, you flip your card, your main card that everyone has, your headquarters, you flip it face down. It shows that you've locked, your turn is done. because then it also affects other people, as we'll talk about in a second, in terms of placing their workers. You are locked, meaning no more workers are available to be played in your area, because here's the other aspect I didn't talk about yet. You can play workers on your Tableau, your building spots down here that you may be utilizing, and none of those actually have worker spots because this is around a 3 selection. But you have things like these quarries here, for example, or maybe if I grab 2 different ones this time, quarry and a logging site. And so you can see, so at the top here, you can see what resource it costs, a wood, in order to build this, or in order to build this. There's a worker placement spot right there, and I can place one of my workers on that Tableau if I'd like. But you just heard me say that other people might be able to utilize these spots that I've acquired. And it doesn't seem to be a penalty. There's no restriction on doing that. We'll get to that in just a second, because at first we have to talk about the asymmetry, what these workers provide, and how that plays into things as well. As you can see, I laid out all the various workers that are available to us right here. And so you can see, again, the differences that are available to you. And why this matters is not only that there are worker placement spots that you can notice on the back of some of these places, meaning that their effect takes place at these locations, or non-dependent location abilities as well. Goblins, well, they're just your generic workers. They have nothing special. Skeletons, well, they're skeletons, so you don't need to feed them. Oh, we'll talk about that next, right? Ogres. Ogres are, well, you'll see right here, you get double resources wherever you place an ogre. And so if it's, the food here, the meat, the fish, the grain, you get 2 of them. But if you place them on, say, one of these other quarries that I just showed you, you'll also notice that you get double there too. So I would get 4 or there in place of that. The elves, well, we'll talk about the elves in just a second. We'll do the dwarves first. Dwarves, actually, if they're placed on locations, cost you 1 less resource of whatever you are building, because they're builders. So you can see here the building action, the dwarves. So if I would have the quarry again, it only costs 1 wood. Well, now it's free. So that's fantastic. And then last but not least, you'll notice that at the beginning of the game, at the beginning of the setup, if you're paying close attention, I actually had it set up like this. Something along those lines, at least. And the elf is there, even though it's only 1 spot, because elf's ability is to go anywhere on any worker placement spot that there isn't already an elf. So they can slide into your DMs, or your resources, if you will, and utilize them in that manner. Now, I just talked about food. I just talked about resources. Those are the 2 main things that you're gathering on all of these worker placement spots for the most part, except for like the resource exchanges, additional free worker placement space, as well as maybe even grabbing one of the boats from the top of the deck, as well as the building cards down here. Because at the end of the round, you have to take a look and see, okay, what workers did I have this round? And based on what workers I had, I have to feed them all. And the tricky part is, like I said, skeletons, don't worry about skeletons. They're skin and bones. They don't know a whole lot. But everything else has to be fed. Your goblins, your dwarves, your elves all require 1 food. Those ogres, you see how big those ogres are. Those ogres require 2 foods per. So you might be paying 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 food per round for these workers. Maybe more, depending on how careful you are, and the next phase of things that we're going to get into, that is the make it or break it decisive element, besides the feeding of your workers. And with the food, there are 3 different types of food that I just showed you right there, right? Your grain, your fish, and your meat. And you're going, well, meat actually feeds 2 people, fish and grain feed 1. So why am I not just going for meat all the time? Meat spoils, fish spoils. If you can't use it, it doesn't carry over to the next round. Meat, you just lose altogether completely. Fish are kind of nice, though. If you get an extra fish and you have to discard it, well, you actually get a victory point. And grain, grain stays around, so you can just keep on utilizing that, but it only feeds 1 person, just like the fish. So you got to be careful about, going forward and sticking with it if you, have enough in that way. Now, the divisive thing that I just alluded to, right, is going to be the other biggest make it or break it, I feel like, for people that you're going to love or you're going to hate. So I mentioned that at the end of every round, you are, when you lock out, going to be feeding your workers, and then you're going to be taking one of said boats up here at the top of the board. And these boats are going to be sitting here, and so you can see them all throughout the round, and everyone knows what's available because they don't refill. So once one person goes out, they get to grab whatever boat they want, and the rest going out later, potentially it's, often advantageous to go out later, sometimes in worker placement rounds. Well, they're going to have less to choose from. And the tricky part is these are workers you're only going to get as a one-time bonus. So on this boat, I'm essentially going to get 1 fish, 1 elf, 1 ogre and 1 skeleton. And then the reduced ability is it's going to be, giving me some fish ability right there. I forget what that one says offhand. But, for this one example, 3 dwarves and a meat. And this one's going to give me 2 gold if I'd rather use it for the 2 gold bonus, 2 victory points, as opposed to whatever else is on the bottom of the envoy card if I prefer the first time I do the exchange. But why that matters is because it ties directly into the tableau and the worker placement spots in the city that I've already alluded to. You're going, Chris, well, there's no penalty for playing on other people's worker placement spots. So when someone else plays the quarry and the logging site and I need resources, I'm going to just go play them there instead of on the city. Well, twofold, you need to be aware of 2 things in that manner. Well, one is that if you play them on their tableau, guess what? They get to keep those workers for the next round. You'll notice that none of these workers are color-coded for player, right? Yeah, there's a reason for that, and that's the reason. The second thing is that with the city here, any of these workers that are on the city in front of me right now, not in the tableau, right? Anything out here, all these workers, they just go back to the general supply. They're lost to you. They're no longer your workers. You no longer have them available for you for the next round. Ooh, right? That's the big twist. That's going to be the big make it or break it for a lot of people in that way. And therefore, that's why the tableau building of these buildings becomes so important. Do you have enough workers to actually play and utilize down here? Because the more you utilize the generalized resources and availabilities here, it's going to actually potentially hurt you because you're going to have less workers available to you. It's going to cost you less to feed and upkeep because that's also a significant issue we have to talk about as well. But it's going to be potentially, a little bit of a balancing act as a whole. So then we talk about the buildings. The buildings, well, I mean, you build buildings, right? You've got 3 different types of buildings that I talked to you about, the ones that gather the resources that I've already showed you, and then you've got 2 of the others. These 2 others you have, as I, drop it and also show you along with the lines over here, you've got end game scoring ones, so 2 points for every skeleton I own at the end of the game in the 5th round. And then you've got the passive ones that add gold to them as you're doing whatever action says. Place 1 gold here whenever you spend 1 or more ore. And you're going, Chris, well, that sounds fine. I'm just going to gather up all the skeletons I can. I'm going to get a bunch of bonus points this way. And that's cool. I understand that. It's straightforward. However, the twist with this one is the Dwarven Smithy here, as all these passives do, right? Okay, so I place 2 gold here as I spend ore twice in the round, essentially, right? And so at the end of the round, I get my 2 victory points. And you're like, oh, okay, Chris, that's cute. That's quaint. That's whatever. Whoa! Let's talk about this a second. Those gold that you're used to then, allocating and getting rid of, those gold that I'm talking about, just stay on there. So the next round, if I do that 2 different more times to build other things and to spend more ore, guess what? That's 4. Now at the end of that round, I'm going to get 4 points. You just get how many of your points are on there at the end of every round. Now, that's a little bit more impressive and a little bit better, right? Because I can't tell you necessarily how many of the dwarves I'm going to have at the end of the round or how many ogres I'm going to have at the end, So that's what you're going to be having to manage and why that's so interesting. And that brings up the other interesting dynamic of maybe you're going to want to put some of your workers in other people's tableaus, not because you want them to have them, but because you want them to stay in the generalized pool. So maybe then they'll be enticed or they'll have plenty enough to put them back on yours later. Is that a dynamic that you're willing to bet or bank on? The next divisive element, though, that you have to be aware of is that it's a little bit cutthroat in a different way. I've mentioned these envoy cards over here, right? And you need to fill them with your boats that you have access to. And so you're going to get a boat, additional boat of workers at the end of rounds 1, 2, and 3. So essentially you will have 4 of these boats at the end of the game after round 3. And you'll have 4 of them that are utilizable. And you'll have the ability to fill up 4 of these envoys with these because they're going to be available to you in order to use. However, you'll also notice that, the envoys become less valuable as the rounds go on with this round marker up here that says round 1, you get 4 gold per whatever exchange you're doing. Round 2, you get 3. Round 3, you get 3. Round 4, you get 2. And round 5, if you do whatever is on this envoy, you only actually get 1 gold each time you're doing it, each time, right? Because all of these also say 1 to 4, 1 to 4, 1 to 2, whatever it may be, like I said. The tricky part is, though, if you don't put one of your boats on there, if you can't utilize whatever resources are needed, say, for this skeleton apprentices, and if I do not have this in a round where I can spend this, and I do not fill it, I lose it. You're going, okay, that's not a big deal, Chris. I'll just go get another one, right? There's another round. There's another stuff coming up that gets recycled every round. No big deal. You lose 5 gold. You lose 5 victory points. And that goes straight into the other side of things is when I was talking about feeding those workers, right? If you don't feed your workers, again, you go, Chris, whatever. You lose 3 gold per worker you can't feed, right? That's a lot of victory points to potentially lose. So that's the dynamic of, 1, Are you willing to take that risk? Can you actually mitigate enough victory points in order to make up for that if you're not willing to do what it needs in the first place? But, you know, how do you feel about that as a whole? And then again, you rinse and repeat. You have the buildings down here that you're going to be grabbing from, putting them in your hand before you can build them in as a whole. You have the favor track, and then you also have the upper city track. I mentioned the Arcanum that you're going to be placing here. The favor track has done something differently, as you saw me using the example earlier. You have your track markers, and the interesting thing is, we'll use some Arcanum here just as placeholders because I don't have the other two colors available to me, is that if you move a favor track and there's no space, you don't, as in almost every other game I've played like this, put that just on top of the next one and get whatever one is next. You actually go to the next available open space and you fill that. And so therein you play just basically leapfrog and seeing what you can get and dynamically depending on what is available to you. So that is Yonder as a whole. That is the game in a nutshell without going into too much of the other minutia or the turn-by-turn, round-by-round rules specifics, right? Pros, cons, who's going to like it, who's going to not like it, what do they need to know, where are things at? Well, I mean, I already covered most of the big points during the overview, right? The big points that you're maybe pro or con not going to like. Pro, it's doing things differently in those dynamic ways, right? The buildings in terms of some of the passives and some of the accumulation of the gold on those. The tableau where you can play other people's tableaus. But then again, the other pro con is any of your workers that are out here on the board, you're going to lose them at the end of the round. And you have to be playing your tableau. You have to optimize your tableau enough that you can sustain some of your workers for carryover. Because to be honest with you, 3 or 4 workers in a round may not be enough to do half the things you want to do. And people who can better utilize that and have maybe 5 or 6, even if you have to spend a little bit more time feeding them, it may really, really benefit you. Because you're going to be playing other people's tableaus. Because their tableau spots are just that much better than the city spots. I mean, yeah, some of the city spots are going to allow you for better resource exchange, but that's also where the envoys are going to come in order to mitigate being in the city in the first place. The other dynamic that I mentioned as well is the envoys. The envoy dynamic, because these envoys are a little bit easier and a little bit more tempting, especially at the early rounds, for just the generalized resource exchange here with some of the A's, right? Get a food to get gold and to move up the favor track, right? Spend a food and in wood there 2 times and you get an extra worker. So that's really alluring. But again, if you can't do it later, if you can't continually have the output for this, it may hurt you rather than help you. But you'll also notice that in the earlier rounds, you get more gold for more exchanges. So round 1, I'm going to get 8 gold if I do this twice. In round 4, I'm going to get 4 gold if I do this twice. That's victory points there, folks. And so you might be tempted to ditch this one later for one of the C ones if you can't fill it, or you don't want to try and fill all 4 of them, all 4 every single round, based on the boats you have. And that's going to be the dynamic that you're going to be, select with. And again, the other issue is, from the worker placements, right? When you go out, you then get to choose your boat first. And so going out first can, be a little bit of catch-up leader in that style to give you better choices. And how do you feel about that, of not having the same workers that you had before? It just offers a different tactical dynamic, and it definitely throws some of the strategy out the window if you're a pure strategist from that side of things, right? Not a bad thing, because they're also face up the whole round, so you can see what's coming, you can think accordingly, but you also may not be able to get accordingly. And does that matter to you? I love the buildings, the dynamics of the buildings. Again, I worry a little bit about the differences between, said the end game scoring ones here or versus, the passive ones. Of just the balancing act in terms of points, because these are accumulations and these are very worker, did I keep them or did I lose them dependent. So I can't speak to that. I'm not a game designer, but that's just my concern as a whole. I'm just making sure, again, those are exactly where they need to be. The other thing I have to talk about is kind of a little bit of a con here, is that the favor track and the upper city. I mean, they're both nice. They're both nice bonuses, but I don't feel overly enticed by either of them at times, except if I have a bunch of resources that I'm really having absolutely nothing to do with, and then I'm going up here, right? But then again, I'm having to potentially burn some of my workers. And so I didn't feel super enticed, because especially at higher player counts, and maybe that's the other main criticism to go along with this, there is no adjustment for worker placement spots depending on the players, right? Obviously, with more players, you're going to have more tableau spots that you can place them on, so that's great, but it doesn't select or change the dynamics of availability here, except for the use of the elves, which kind of mitigates that as a whole, so it's not as big of an issue. But, again, with the tableau over here and the tableau over here that do not get refilled mid-round, Like if I pull this and you're playing with 2 players, right, I still have another 5 cards. If I pull this and I'm playing with 3 other players, well, now this is a lot more selective in terms of what I'm going to be available with and how I'm going to change things. So, I mean, I almost wish it was a little bit of refilling in that aspect at the higher player counts to mitigate that. And I'll be frank, again, the city track here, the upper city track and the favor track, the bonuses are nice, but I didn't feel ultimately like super enticed that I needed to do them. They're nice. They're additional benefits. If I could do them, I would. But again, balancing all of those other issues as a poor Eurogamer, worker placement player, I didn't feel like it was necessary. And maybe that's just me and my own bias and my own inability to recognize the importance of them in that aspect. But again, like the other issue with that, I guess maybe more from a favor track side of things, is that, like I said, right, because you skip, there's also, you'll notice in the top, sort of, Eye of Sauron-esque, there is no benefit for getting to the top. So once this would say happen, there's nothing else that this person can do. There's no other benefit. They can't get one of these 3. There's no benefit for getting to the top. And so there's no incentivized to really rush up it or to have that be a significant dynamic element other than just whatever the square is that you may or may not want at that time. So again, that was more the incentivized, why am I doing this aspect as a whole. So other than that, I mean, otherwise, I think it fits a niche, right? Personally speaking, I was a little worried 5 rounds with this many workers and looking at the beginning of the game before playing it that, okay, if I have these workers, on this boat, and then I'm getting, 3 more skeletons, and then another round, I'm getting 2 more skeletons and a dwarf. Okay, is that going to just, lead to some worker bloat so that, by round 3 or 4, I'm going to have like this many workers and, oh, geez, the turns are, the turns that people are going to be taking during a round are just so long and it's going to get so crowded and just, you're going to have to do so much planning for the food side of things. No, I mean, you lose workers and it actually makes it much smoother and it works out much nicer in that sense. And the fact that you also stop getting workers at the end of round 3, potentially, also makes it that much more cutthroat for rounds 4 and 5. It does. And so that's going to, again, be probably a bigger make it or break it for people. Again, I like the asymmetry between these cards. And it just works. I mean, there's not too many resources as well for a non-resource driven person where I don't want 13 different resources. This is enough. And so because of those dynamics, I think it's doing things enough differently, potentially, if you're looking at this and going, how does this compare to other similar games? It's not super heavy. It's not, maybe mid-weight, maybe a notch between, light and medium weights, if you will. But it's smooth. And SInister Fish has already said that there's going to be extra, content, gameplay content, like they've done with their other campaigns, Moons, Villages, those sort of things, etc., with a little duxification, but also with some extra gameplay. So I wouldn't be surprised if they've got just a little bit of extra envoy, a little extra building here, and maybe even a worker or 2 that we haven't seen yet with this, which would be something interesting. So yeah, there you go. That's Yonder. My thoughts on it. Hopefully that's helpful in figuring out whether or not it's right for you. It's one of those that, as a worker placement, like I was just talking about, the one from Paverson from Distilled in a recent review, where I saw the mechanics and they were really, really great. But I looked at it and I said, this is going to be too complicated for the vast majority of people I play with, right? And so it's going to be a harder keep for me from that aspect. This would be easier because there's an easier dynamic of overview slightly, but there's also slightly less that you're managing comparatively. So it's going to last a little longer. But again, I'm not sure, again, all the people I play with would always want to have this. I'm having to be careful not to get myself into a hole because I've lost too many workers on the main board that I can't do what I want next round, because that's the hole you can potentially end up in, or the hole of, well, I can't feed my workers and I can't, or didn't pay my envoys, essentially use my envoys. And so I'm really going to get handicapped and hamstrung because I may or may not have had that happen to me in my first game. Yeah. Who's at 0 points in the middle of round 3? Yeah, that's me. Okay, because again, like I said, with all of these games, right? Like I said this in my recent news video, I love playing games. I suck at them in terms of winning. I understand them. Understanding and being actually able to do, right? I see those soccer moves that they're doing on TikTok that I show my kids that they want to do and be really cool with. I see how they're doing them. The acts of me actually trying to put that on the field, on the ground, whoo boy, that's a whole nother thing. That's a whole nother video. That's all I got. Thanks for watching. Stay classy. Have a great freaking day. Questions, comments, concerns down below. Peace out.